Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our second Changemakers webinar. I'd like to take a moment to let everyone know at the start that we have live transcription going on for this session. This means each participant can choose to use this feature if needed. I am Ian Gordon, the Vice President of Community Impact and Engagement here at the United Way of the National Capital Area. United Way of National Capital Area is uniquely positioned at the intersection of public, private, philanthropic, and nonprofit sectors to bring the best resources, individuals, and organizations together to address the most pressing issues facing our communities today. We do so by shining a light on the racial inequities and other disparities that plague our region. Today is the second in a 10-part education series that brings together thought leaders in conversations focused on trends and solutions that advance equity in our region. Topics will include intersectionality of gender and equity, racial equity in program design, the impact of COVID-19 on mental health, and more. At United Way NCA, we truly believe that when none are ignored, all will thrive. I'm honored to moderate today's topic. The topic is approaches to increase economic opportunities for young men of color. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, we'd like to get to know our audience. Throughout today's session, there will be a few questions in the chat for our audience to respond to. This will help us to focus this conversation in a way that is meaningful to you. So please take a moment to tell us about yourself. Here's the first set of questions. All right. Results are coming in now. Looks like we have lots of folks coming in to learn about solutions to greater socioeconomic equity. Great. Folks are also interested in learning the causes of socioeconomic inequities. Great. It's almost even, except the solutions are really what people want to hear. So that makes a lot of sense to me, and our panelists will certainly provide solutions for us. Well, before we begin, I want to encourage you to use the chat and use the raise your hand feature when we get to the Q&A portion of our discussion. We will do our best to get to all the questions, and please answer the questions in the Q&A portion, not in the chat. It's also time for another question. So we really want to better understand what brought you here today. Let's take a moment to answer this question in the chat. It takes just a second for those to come up. Okay, here we go. All right, so we have a good representation of employees of intermediary organizations. We also have some funders in the room, advocates for racial equity, that's great, and service providers. So great, we have a good cross-section of folks here with us today on this webinar, so that's great. All right, to jumpstart our conversation, I'm going to provide the context to really ground today's topic. Our country's persistent social inequities are widespread, rooted in structural and also in institutional racism. And those really do prevent our boys and young men of color from reaching their full potential. Research shows that children from communities of color are between 6 and 9 times more likely than white children to live in areas of concentrated poverty. According to the Obama Center's My Brother's Keeper Alliance, Black students represent 16% of the public school population, where 42% of them are suspended more than once, and 34% are expelled. When we look at high school graduation rates, Black and Latinx students are graduating at rates 16 and 12% points lower than white students, respectively. And as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has made these challenges worse, and that can be seen in college enrollment among young men of color. It looks like we're going to have the Q&A. We're gonna open up for Q&A, but I just want to, before I do that, thinking about these bleak trends, the overarching question for our webinar today is, how do we prepare young men of color to succeed and move beyond poverty? Our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, will share their experiences and their innovative solutions. We want to hear from them how they've used their work to break the pattern of social inequities and the systemic racism, and how they've uplifted and advanced young men of color. I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists now. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's session. We have Heath Carelock. Heath is the director and financial counselor for the United Way NCA's Financial Empowerment Center at Prince George's Community College. We also have Brian Heath, the program manager for the Diverse Male Student Initiative at Prince George's Community College. We have Anthony Featherstone, who's the executive director of WorkSource Montgomery, and Eldridge Allen, the senior business development manager for the Greater Washington Urban League. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We see that many of the reasons that too many boys and young men of color don't succeed in education and don't have access to economic opportunities compared to their white and Asian counterparts are because of inequities. Brian, you've seen many young men of color succeed through the Diverse Male Student Initiative. You lead that on the Prince George's Community College campus, as I mentioned before. Can you share the inequities that your students are experiencing and what you say would you say that those are systemic?
I got a chance to think about that question a bit. So first of all, thank you for the platform. And I'm humbled to be on the platform with such esteemed panelists. And I assume the same thing for the audience that is tapping in. They care enough about this platform and this audience. But I think the major inequity that we have is a deficit mindset. Is that, I talked about yesterday having this conversation about calling people minorities and men of color being called minorities and then being called the other and being called at risk. That although these numbers point to, I guess, technically why these names are being used, but those labels actually become boxes. And they don't just become boxes, they become jail cells, if you want to get specific. And so what happens is you start to have young Black and brown boys that don't believe generation after generation after generation that they can succeed. All they believe is they can pass, they can obey, they can follow in line, and they really can then by default go along with the trend. We are underachievers, we are underperformers, and the best thing we can hope to accomplish is we just won't get in trouble. We just won't be a menace to society. But in terms of striving, that's what's systemic. It's a systemic issue of underachieving. That's what it ends up being. And it happens a lot within impoverished communities because you have limited resources. Limited resources lead itself to limited exposure. So the under-resourced community is a product of systemic racism, I believe, in this country, but then that leads itself into labeling yourself as a secondary, second-class citizen that has no desire or the belief that they can rise above what the statistics say they're possible of rising above.
That's a very powerful way of framing that. In terms of limited resources, limited exposure, and as you said, the boxes that confine how well our young men of color can do. So, Eldridge, I'm going to ask you, what can we do to disrupt this system of inequity and provide environments in which boys and young men of color will thrive?
Thank you for that, Ian. And again, Brian, thank you for the setup. I'll just kind of move it along from there. One thing we have to realize: reality, structural, institutional, systemic racism exists, and since we know it exists, we have to recognize it. And with the recognition, we have to challenge it. We have to confront it. We have to fight it. We have to defeat it at any cost. All hands on deck on this, because it is kind of asinine and ridiculous for these things to still be in place in 2022, when our parents and our grandparents did all of the legwork and the fighting for this not to be the case for their children, their grandchildren. So it's on all hands on deck when it comes to realizing that this is the situation that we're in. Brian hit on something else, not just a redefinition, but a re-understanding and re-identification for ourselves. We have to get into a cancellation of the concept of the other. We're seen as the other, and we're studied and we're reported on as the other, and statistics are done as the other, rather than being integral in the inclusion of the American fabric. And once we take that stance, then we're on a different playing field. Not about, this is something that needs to be given to me, this is a right, and these are things that I need to fight for and ensure that I have, or my neighbor has, or my family has, or my community has. In regards to the excellence that Brian spoke about, and again, in answering the question that you're posing to me, what things do we need to put in place? On abroad, we need to put in place everything. But in the individual, we have to re-engage a sense of excellence. There's sometimes I do go on social media, and outside of looking at dance steps and cats and babies and cooking, there is some information that you can get from social media. And a very well-known media personality gave a story that I listened to just yesterday, and it's a story about, excuse it if you don't want to hear about it, it's an insect, it's a flea. And he started off with telling that, do you know that a flea can actually have a jump height of 36 inches, just off of liftoff, 36 inches. Now, equate that to what a human being does. All right, so just look at that. A flea can just on its own go 36 inches. Now, if you put a flea inside of, let's say, a mason jar, you've limited the amount of height it can actually get to. And it gets used to not going to its highest of 36. It stays the height of that mason jar. And if you put two fleas in, then the two fleas are only used to going that height. And if they reproduce, then that young flea has it in the mind that all they know how to do is go the length or the height of that mason jar. So with that, what do we have to do? Some would say just take off the lid. So one thing is that naturally we are meant to succeed. It's a natural thing for everyone to want to succeed, not limit, but go beyond boundaries. So if you take off that mason jar top, yes, you can go higher. I say break the jar altogether. Break the damn jar. Know that our nature is to exceed and to excel, and that becomes our starting point.
Thank you, Eldridge. I really do appreciate that. You know, it really is about, in the right environment, you know, people, period, will succeed. And by not othering or limiting young men of color, we're saying the same thing for young men of color, right? That they will succeed given the right environment. So I really do appreciate what you've both shared. Now, Anthony and Heath.
Ethan, can I add something really quickly? The program I here have at DMSI is that I'm the program manager of the Diverse Male Student Initiatives program here at Prince George's. Now I'm gonna give you the beginning of the now than the beginning. Last semester, we got granted a $3.7 million grant for the efforts of our accomplishments in transforming these extraordinary lives of guys at DMSI. Some of my guys are honor students. Some of my guys have gone on to four-year institutions. We have a pipeline with Morehouse, all these amazing things, but watch this. When I first got here, they wanted DMSI to be a program for the Black and brown men that couldn't get it together. That is a systemic problem. Is that why when you're creating a retention program at one of the biggest community colleges in the state of Maryland, why when you're creating the foundational elements of a program, do Black and brown men immediately have to be targeted as the ones that can't get it right? And I had to fight to make sure that this would not be that type of program, that it would be a program for the high achievers, the middle of the roaders, and the guys at the bottom. So now we can all rise as one. But in this country, again, young Black and brown boys are so much seen at risk, we keep targeting the at risk and not realizing we're not a monolith, we're multi-level. But if you don't take the blinders off, you're going to continue doing these at-risk other minority male approaches that keeps us repeating the cycles over and over again. I'm sorry, my heart got the best of me. I had to interject, but I lived that here at the institution. And that's why the program is now so successful, because I fought for a new narrative. And when I fought for a new narrative, we had crazy retention numbers, crazy graduation numbers that then attracted a $3.7 million grant because we went against that systemic approach and created our own narrative.
That's very powerful, because what you're really saying is that the solution can be as systemically rooted in racism itself as the problem that we're trying to solve. I definitely hear you on that. Anthony and Heath, through your work at WorkSource Montgomery and the United Way NCA's Financial Empowerment Center at Prince George's County, respectively, each of you at those two institutions, what trends or challenges have been the most pressing in your work with youth prior to the pandemic? And has COVID-19 made a change or created new challenges? If Heath, you can go first, and then Eldridge, you can follow up.
So when it comes to youth and finances, people want the next biggest thing. And so they're hearing things on YouTube, they're hearing things on TikTok, they're hearing things all over the place. And in a financial counseling coaching setting, you have to have the resource of money in order to do some of the things you hear about and see about. So people will come, they want to do cryptocurrency, they want to flip homes, they want to do tax liens, they want to invest in the stock market and do all these types of things. But the truth is, there has to be a basis for that with your earnings. And unfortunately, people have these setbacks along the way where you ask, the average student what their issues are. Some issues are, hey, can I make it back to the college campus next semester? Will I have enough to go off of? Will financial aid even know my story? And so one of the things that Brian and I alike stress is that you have to have a proper relationship with the financial aid office. And a lot of that is getting a FAFSA done. So we have to backtrack sometimes before we can get on the fast track. We all like, cash flow quadrant and Robert Kiyosaki's deals with Rich Dad, Poor Dad. But in order to get over there, even Robert Kiyosaki advises that you got to get through the rat race before you can get out of it. And you do that through disciplined financial bearings, which include how you earn money, how you save money, how you give money, how you protect your money, and responsible with spending and borrowing. And if you do those things, it means that I can serve you on this end as a program director, as a financial counselor, as a financial coach, as somebody who's moved thousands of people through programs that will even get them money and give them money, raise credit scores, things like that. So it's all about the logic of where do I start and giving people that. And the conversation, and Anthony knows this as well, is much bigger than financial literacy. Probably the biggest area that I was sort of in my role, I was on a panel 3 years ago or so, and another panelist sort of went to town dogging financial literacy as an area. And she said, basically it helps people, you're just teaching people how to stay poor. And she didn't know the scope of the work that we did. Part of the framing, we've heard the comments about framing a moment ago, but part of the framing on financial success is calling it financial empowerment as opposed to financial literacy, calling it wealth literacy as opposed to financial literacy. As I tell people, Financial literacy is not a destination, right? It's a cog. And when you treat it as a cog, it helps to open gateways to wealth, to richness, to opportunities. And that's what we want to do in this role.
That's
And
great.
so it's fun to go last after these three gentlemen because they've said some powerful things, but I want to backtrack and I want to answer this question. There are systemic issues that lead to inequities. This is a real story. You've got a young man who's putting either the wrong things in his body or not enough in his body from a nutritional standpoint, because he either lives in a food desert or there's a carry out in reach when there's not healthy options in reach. There's crime. So he gets a lack of a good night's rest because of the crime that's happening. First responders are on the scene. They may be on the scene late, but when they get on the scene, the lights are on and the sirens are going. He has to go to school the next morning, so he's tired. And when he gets woken up, he's frustrated. So then there's behavior issues, which could lead to IEPs and things like that. Then he's being taught by someone who may not be the top tier in their profession, because the top tier is in another school in another neighborhood. So he's behind, right? He's got a lot of uphill battles and struggles to face before he can even think to be at a level playing field. These are systemic issues, whether it's infrastructure when it comes to grocery stores and healthy food options, public safety, whether it comes to resources that go into our public schools and so forth. I don't want to sound like a politician, but these are systemic things that young men and women of color, and Brian, thanks for teaching me to use that term because I like it more than the vulnerable and all these other words. These are the things that we face. So we've got to get active on a local level. We got to put pressure on our politicians to do the work in leveling the playing fields. And I think that to answer your question, what we've seen at WorkSource Montgomery is kind of a lot of the same. So we operate federal workforce programs, and we may have a young person that comes into our office and needs help, and they may be facing homelessness. And we have to dive deep, get invasive because of federal requirements that require us to do so that we can help the person that needs help. And in the bag in the car with mom is not enough proof that they're experiencing housing instability or homelessness. We have to go deeper. So the number of people that we see versus the number of people that actually need help and get the help, there's a huge delta there. And the delta is because there are a lot of red tape and there's a lot of, whole hoops to jump through to actually get the help that you need in certain programs. And I'm not knocking these programs, but I think we have to also be advocates on a local level to all the way up to the federal level. So we let these legislators know what's happening on the ground and the help that people really need and make that help more seamless to get to. So that's what we're struggling with right now. We're trying to cut out as many layers and make it as seamless as possible to get help when you are in dire need, bottom line. We don't have to get as invasive and go through the whole gauntlet or take you through a gauntlet to prove that you're homeless when you've got a car in the parking lot with all of your belongings in. So I think that's one thing we've seen pre-pandemic, and it's something that we still see now, but it's exacerbated because now a lot of things are still happening virtually. And then there's a digital divide as well that provides a hindrance also. So I wish this was a longer conversation because I'm sure we could carry it on for a long time, but I think that's what we're seeing from a workforce development standpoint and operating a lot of our federal programs.
Anthony and Heath, I really appreciate that. And Anthony, your perspective around it's more of a holistic solution to a holistic problem, right? And so we can talk about what's brought us here, but to be able to get to solutions, it's not just about the economics, not just about the financial. That's definitely important. But before we can even get there, there are these other issues that we need to address the whole person. Now, I'd like to open it up, to really get to something that we heard from the folks on this call, which is really around, solutions, which you've given us some of. But when we think about, supporting boys and young men of color, we think about those critical transition phases, right? That phase from middle to high school, and as they move from high school to college or the career path. How can we best support boys and young men of color during those transition phases? Because I'm imagining that they require different things at different stages. Anthony, while you had the mic last, so you wanna jump in here?
Yeah, sure. So I'm real staunch on exposure. When you have a certain socioeconomic status or background coming up, you get to see a lot of things. You take a lot of trips. You get to see a lot of people doing a lot of different occupations. Your exposure to the world is just much broader than the folks that we're talking about right now, our people. So I think, and I always say this, all the time, with our staff, it's hard to be what you can't see. So at that critical juncture, when you're going from middle school to high school, career experiences are important. Latching on to a mentor is important. They can show you, kind of what they've been through, what they do, and what it takes to get there and to get other, places with other occupations is important. So I think really mentorship is key, and providing exposure to folks in the inner city and folks that come or live from, under-resourced neighborhoods is crucial, but it takes money. And I always say that. And when I say it from a money perspective or from a fiscal perspective, I've seen some paid internship programs work in other states and in other jurisdictions where you pay mentors to latch on to young kids. I was one of those mentors, and I still have a relationship 15 years later with the young man who was in 7th grade that I started to mentor. But I took it as a part-time job, but it turned into a little cousin, little brother, nephew, whatever you have it. But it started there, and it started with me and 100 other young men of color, fresh out of college, that were paid mentors that put the time in to make sure that we essentially paid it forward to some folks who really needed to be mentored at the time. So I think mentorship is crucial, but mentorship takes money if you're really going to operationalize it and scale it. So for us, that's a big point of emphasis, something that we're trying to work towards. It's easier said than done, but it's something that we're trying to work towards here in Montgomery County.
That's great. Any of the gentlemen want to weigh in on that one in terms of how to best support boys and young men of color at those critical transition phases in life?
I'll tap in. My background, when I came out of South Carolina State, I got my degree in K through 12. So I spent a lot of my years either a classroom teacher, dean of students, vice principal, or principal, primarily in that middle school space and a little bit of high school. But what they need is they need consistency, and they need greater expectations. I told an audience, again, I travel as a speaker and a trainer across the country. And I tell audiences, most Black boys and men of color are trained to behave, not to excel. So when they come and talk to you, the first thing they'll say is, Mr. Heath, I passed my class. And I'll say, okay, that's fine. And they'll say, you don't seem excited. I said, well, whatever happened to excelling? So they need consistency, but also consistency of expectation that they're expected to walk in excellence. Now, we'll help you get there, right? If you have some deficits, but consistent mentorship, consistent love. I had a choice recently. My 13-year-old son, we were looking at 2 different schools. One school had a stronger academic rigor, but one school, from the time he walked in the door to the classroom, about 8 people told my son they loved him. Hey, Quest, I love you, and a hug. Hey, Quest, I love you. How's this? How's that? He felt a cultural acceptance. He felt loved in the building. So my thing was, yeah, the academic rigor is a little bit less, but that love and that reinforcement was so strong that my son was going to develop and blossom much further than just the school with the academic rigor. So number one is consistency of mentorship, consistency of love, consistency of you can achieve at a high level and will help you get there. And just letting them know that whatever they can dream of and put the work behind, they can achieve. And that there's a coolness in being brilliant. Too often in the Black and brown community, we almost seek street validation. We want to be the drug dealers sometimes in our communities. We want to be what the hip hop video says should get our street credibility. And I tell my son, man, I say, look, man, it's cool to be smart. It's cool to be brilliant. And now I want you to walk with that swagger. So again, if you teach those young men to accept their brilliance and to manifest it, despite what their other friends will say, that he's going to get a lot further in life. So again, consistency in terms of mentorship, consistency of love, consistently push them to higher expectations for themselves and to embrace their brilliance as being what's really cool.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Brian. I'm sure if we were in an audience, you hear a lot of amens in the room, because I think that definitely will strike a good note in terms of embracing excellence, right? And really thinking about that is what we want to aspire to be, and that's what gets rewarded. And definitely being in an environment of love. I mean, nothing could say it better than that, just to be embraced. And that's really what young people want, right? Is to be seen and to be accepted.
That's right.
When we're thinking about those who have joined us today, I read some of the folks that are categories of folks that are here with us. Most of them are here to learn about how we can collectively better support our young men of color. So I'm going to throw this out. What are some key takeaways or advice that you can provide us on how the funding community specifically and intermediary groups like the United Way of National Capital Area and also individuals can support boys and young men of color? Some key takeaways and advice for folks.
On funding?
So certainly we can go with funding for sure.
So
philanthropy
certainly plays a role, because the goal of philanthropists is to transform communities with the resource of treasure. And that has such an appeal at the national level, international level, and at the local level. And I do believe that a lot of these programs that Eldridge has spoken of and that Anthony has spoken of require funding. Brian himself told you about the federal government's commitment on a national grant of $3.7 million. Well, that's going to help create jobs. That's going to help with bus tours to college campuses and a lot more with giving students the wraparound services they need to succeed. And that's really critical. In terms of funding in a strategic way, I think you have to do needs assessments and you have to have community input. Participatory action research was created, PAR was created because the researchers and academicians are in the ivory tower spinning their wheels. But what really matters is, what do the subjects of that research experience? Why can't they be a part of it? And so getting more buy-in from folks, and this gets down to something that Eldridge and I have talked about in the past, which is voting. We live in a democratic republic, in a market-based economy, capitalistic economy. People have to fundamentally know how to participate. And we have to fund things like civics and life skills. You want to know about the apathy people feel and why people aren't responsive to opportunities when there are programs designed, and we wonder why there's low participation? That's something that hasn't been cultivated or practiced at scale. Now, it was demonstrated during the civil rights movement. We've seen different upticks when certain candidates run. But as you know, this can't be something that just is only a once in a generational participation. That creates the same problems over and over again, because the people who decided to give Brian the $3.7 million, well, those people had congressmen and women who had staffers who had a certain perspective and who said to the education committees and such, we're going to allocate this much to this department or agency, who then is able to give money to sensitive matters, who can give sympathy toward programs like Brian's and give that money out. And the same works for philanthropies and otherwise. That's very important.
Can I also add that it's also important about the people who get the money? So when I got the money, when my institution got the money, let me be clear, Brian didn't get the money, but the institution got the money, is that I felt like it was an obligation at a national level to do the very best I could with that funding so that it could reassure the funders that when you put money behind Black and brown boys, as a matter of fact, I didn't tell you, the grant was so substantial, we were able not just to give it to Black and brown boys in my program, but my sister program ran by my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Pear, who runs the Women of Wisdom. Now she got money as well based upon that. But I realized that if I didn't do well, and we didn't do well, it would reinforce the stereotype that we cannot, we talk a big game about the problem, but we're not just as dedicated to the solution. So I say, you know what? I want more people to get the funding. I want more programs to get the funding, not just mine. So what should I do? Do the best job I can with that 3.7. Do the best job I can. So when other people in the same space go to apply, again, people are going to say, you know what? Brian Heath over there at PGCC, he knocked it out the park. Let me give something to Anthony. Let me give something to Eldridge. Let me give something to Heath. Let me give something to Ian. So if you're on the funding side, make sure you're receiving the funds, make sure you receive it knowing that it's your obligation, not just to do well for your own program, but so it sets the precedent that these dollars are being well invested.
Ian, if I tie in on that, someone in the chat placed a little message that said that language and words matter. So feeding off of that or coming off of that, let's look at the word commitment. So there has to be a commitment to care for the welfare and the excellence of Black and brown boys. And you have to test that commitment. It can't be just word worthy. It has to be words in action. So if you're committed as an individual, show your commitment. If you're committed as a community, show that the community focus is on the excellence and enhancing. If it's commitment by a politician that says they want to be reelected, then make them own up to their words. If it's a commitment that there's a corporate commitment by an organization, then make them own up to their words. You have a choice as to what you're going to do and how you're going to test someone's commitment. So it's an individual thing, it's a community thing, it's a corporate thing, it's a thing as a whole. So with that, we started off with statistics as it pertained to young boys of color and with education. So let's really talk about statistics. Statistics go to situations, that goes to strategies, and then hopefully leads to solutions. All right. If you're not following that line and you're breaking that line, then you're going to have the same things happening over and over and over again. You have to want to get to the end goal. If you have a statistic that measures what a situation is, then what is going to be your solution? All right. And what is going to be your dedication, your commitment to seeing that solution being impactful? And why? I had the advantage of coming into community and economic development through, of all places, a corporate entity, a bank. All right. Now, you think that bankers think one thing, but bankers know a lot of things and they touch a lot of parts of lives. All right. So understanding that information, when it's done correctly and somebody has funds to do something with, if you have correct information, then what you can do with the funds you have at hand. That goes into the work that Heath and I are doing as a part of the financial empowerment centers that are funded through the United Way. All right, we understand that it's not just the literacy, but it's the information put in action and correct action that actually goes into forming habits, that goes into how you're dealing with your finances. All right, very, very important. Follow that line. Find those resources, find the help. Our centers are here to assist. We go past just the words. We go past, as Heath was saying, some people have a negative connotation of financial literacy. All right. If you don't want to use financial literacy, say financial management skills building. All right. Find something more advanced if you want to see something more advanced happen with your money, with your funds, getting to the goals that you have. All right. It takes work off both sides. It takes the work that Heath and I are doing in our centers, but it takes the resources of people that are funding our centers and knowing that it's not just something they want to see in a year. 1 year's worth of financial work is not going to pull everyone totally out of their situation. That's not going to happen. And giving them the resources to that is not just going to happen in a year. So that 1 year needs to be 3 years. Those 3 years need to be 5. The 5 years needs to be 10. All right. Until there's no longer a need for the use of that money to get them out of the hole because there's no more hole anymore. All right. Because we've done the work necessary to get there. All right. And well, there's a couple other things, but we only have a couple more minutes.
We do, Eldridge, and you know, it's always a tightrope walk to do this, because this is such an expansive topic to do it in an hour. But I'm going to hop over to Anthony to see if he has any takeaways before we move into some Q&A from the audience. Anthony.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I see Ivan just posted something in the chat, and you know, I agree. The issue is lack of jobs and economic opportunity. So from a funding standpoint, we need practicality when it comes to funding, and I can only speak from a workforce development perspective. I think that there need to be more conversations from the locals up that convey what actually works based on the needs of our community, and just cutting out the tape so that people can get the help, so that folks can get access to the tools and resources that create that economic mobility. So I think that the money is not the issue. I think that the strings and the lack of practicality that comes with the money at times from our perspective is more so the issue to preventing folks from getting help. So and I agree with everything everybody else just said, but just wanted to add that.
I appreciate it, Anthony. And we're going to do a final poll question because we value, you know, the time that everyone took to be on this call today, and we want to find out if this session was valuable. So just take a moment to answer this question that's coming up right now for us, please. Appreciate it. Thanks to our really great panelists. It seems like folks are learning valuable lessons and getting some real good information here. So we're happy to see that. In terms of just, you know, we're at that time where I'm going to just, you know, recap a little bit of what was said today. There was a lot said there, very rich discussion. You know, it started out talking about, you know, deficit mindset, right? That we need to really not confine and box our young men of color and our boys of color with all the labels that, you know, in turn will keep them from underachieving, right? And that these limited resources and limited exposure really does a disservice to them. You know, there's talk about an all hands on deck, right? The fact that we need to recognize it, challenge it, confront it, fight it, and defeat it when we're talking about structural and institutional racism and systemic racism. Also really around re-engaging in a sense of excellence. What does it mean to be excellent? And that excellence is also, you know, I would even say the birthright of young boys and men of color. And that, you know, we really need to really think about in terms of addressing this. It's really about exposure, right? Exposure to the world, exposure to occupations. Mentoring was said several times, the importance of that, and the importance of financing mentoring, right? To be able to pay mentors. We talked about consistency. It is important to be consistent and have higher expectations with love and support, as Brian so eloquently said. And then for our funders and intermediaries, right? It really is around funding this work and funding the work beyond the typical grant terms, that we're in this with a commitment to boys and young men of color and to be in it for the long haul. You know, they're really talking about the responsibility also from the grantee. So once you're receiving these funds, how important is it that we're good stewards of the funds and that the funds get to serve the community that it is intended for, because there are organizations behind us, organizations around us that need this funding and will deserve to have this funding, but we have to demonstrate being good stewards of that funding. Folks also mentioned about policy and advocacy, the fact that it's important to advocate for boys and young men of color and the needs that they have. And also, I just want to give a nod, because that's important to us at the United Way, is needs assessment and participatory research, speaking to the people who are most impacted and that we claim to be serving, to ensure that their voices are being heard and their situations are understood from their perspective. So Stephanie, I think we can go to Q&A now. Stephanie's going to join us and guide us through that.
Absolutely. And thank you all for putting questions in the Q&A box, and keep them coming. So we'll go ahead and start with the first question, which is, how can we break the system of labeling? How do we begin to rewrite the program if we're not the programmers?
Labeling is a significant challenge, both in the academy, in journalism, as well as in the social media. So in the population, in the culture, right? And to do that, as you've seen with things like Me Too and in the wake of Trayvon Martin and George Floyd, we have to find new ways to talk about these things. And they start with the professionals who have these types of platforms. They start with people that have sort of visited spaces like the religious communities. And it starts with the corporate community as well, because of the messaging power with commercials and other types of advertisements. We have to hold ourselves to that, and we have to incentivize it. We've talked a lot about money, but one of the ways advocacy can work is incentivizing it. The opposite end of that is boycotting, which worked during the civil rights movement. So there's collective action steps that can be taken on that front as well. And this has to also then be traced back to the education system. Teachers who see the future students and the future workforce have to participate in these things. These have to be part of the agenda of PTO meetings. They have to be part of the agenda of principals. Brian said he was a principal. Well, guess what principals do? Back in August, traditionally, that's when the teachers come back. They have to make these things initiatives from that angle as well.
I'll throw this in there as well. And it's a different approach. It's not a different approach. It's a thought. I tell my audiences to become professional stereotype killers. That whatever it is, whatever the box is, like I have tattoos, when I go in these rooms and it's 15,000 practitioners, and the last speaking engagement, I followed Congressman Clyburn, and he was the person before me that I took the stage, and I have shell top Adidas, and I'm and so a person would look at me and say, well, was he incarcerated? Was he in the military? Like my look will tell you something else, but then my college degree, my background, my credentials, my expertise, my accomplishments. I would tell specifically people of color or those in marginalized spaces that the best way to eliminate labeling is to explode them. I think Brother Eldridge said, destroy the whole jar. Just go out here and shock the world, become far more than they expected. And what's going to happen is person by person, the label you used before is not going to hold true consistently, because you keep meeting people that are above and beyond. They're far more, they have more depth and more brilliance and more imagination. So become a stereotype killer. Go beyond the label and set the precedent so people will no longer be able to use that label.
Stephanie, for that, I'm going to give people a twofer. All right, depending on what end of the spectrum you want to come from. If you want to come from the left or from the right, we're going to come in the middle to address what's happening with labeling. The first one, I'm going to parallel with what my brother Brian said. When I was in school in undergrad, Central State University, Wilberforce, Ohio, we had what we call convocations. We had very prominent people come and speak to the entire student body on various things. It was very inspirational. One that stands out in my mind is Nikki Giovanni that came up on stage. And she said a statement, if you don't like the stereotype, change reality. Okay, that's one end. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, if you want to use it, take this one. If you don't want the label or you don't identify with it, don't respond to it. Reject the label that's placed upon you. You choose your identity. You choose what you answer to. You choose how you want to be brought to. If my name is not John, I'm not going to respond to the name John. My name is Eldridge. I will respond to when you called me Eldridge. So if that is what I know I am, that's who I know I am, that's who I respond to. If you place some other identity upon me, I don't respond to that. I reject it. And then you're going to learn how to step to me.
Yeah, and I think just adding on to that, once we do that, and it starts catching on one by one, community by community, city by city, whatever the process is, then you start seeing it disappear from formal documents. Then you'll start seeing the verbiage in law and legislation start to change. But it starts with rejecting it on this level and having these conversations and it kind of spreading as fast or slow or however, at what rate it spreads. But once you do that and once you have that coalition and that consensus, you'll start to see a change on a broader, more macro scale.
And Ian, very quickly, there's one other methodology that I think is worth saying. There's a great TED Talk on this, and it's the difference between calling out, calling on, and calling in.
Mhm.
And the way the speaker presented it was that we can call out all the time. Hey, this is wrong, and beat that drum. We can call on people as well to change their behavior from a strategic standpoint with messaging and other things. But until you call people in, you will not see them really pay you the same level of attention. And so these things can change by having these community conversations, which is partly the responsibility of philanthropy, since they can do convening type behavior and activity. United Way did so at Prince George's Community College after the government shutdown. They called in the types of organizations that could rewrite the strategic plan for the United Way for the next 5 years. So we've seen this happen, and it can transform neighborhoods and communities.
Really, really appreciate that.
Thank you. We did have a few other questions, but we are unfortunately running out of time, so we will try to make sure those questions get addressed. But thank you all so much for your time. Ian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So as I mentioned at the start of the session, today is the second in a 10-part education series where we'll be convening thought leaders like the ones we did today in conversations focused on trends in the National Capital Area that advances equity in our region. And so we want to know if you feel that this session was relevant to you. So please let us know in the chat. We appreciate you bringing your feedback through our session today. And we thank you big thank you to our guests, our panelists, to all of you participants for making time for us today. We appreciate you and hope to see you at our next Changemakers series in May. Have a good rest of your day. And gentlemen, again, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.